Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. And if you're enjoying the interviews here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you're interested or know any folks that would be interested in coming on chatting, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle there is IsaacR11. And reach out to me on Mastodon. My handle there is IsaacR11 at fossen.org. All right, so with that out of the way, I'm really looking forward to my conversation. We're having a great chat before, and I think that we're going to learn a lot of interesting things about this guy. So let's bring him on. So my guest today is Carl Tashian. Carl, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself.
Hey, I'm Carl Tashian. I'm an off-road engineer at Smallstep Labs, and yeah, I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited for you to be here too. We were having some interesting conversations about things that I don't think we're going to talk about today. But one of the things that I do love to find out when I first start talking with folks is like, what's your tech origin story? I imagine, depending on when you got started in technology, it's, one of a few different ways. But one of the things I love to hear is like, what was the first time you came across technology at any age and realized like, oh, I kind of like this thing, this computer thing. Maybe I should stick with it for a bit.
Yeah, I have a memory where I was probably 5 or 6 years old, and I remember it, but it's also in a photograph. So there's this photograph of my family, and it's a portrait. And the funny thing about this portrait is, everybody's standing there smiling for the camera, and then I'm there, and I'm just like staring at this thing. I'm just looking, and what I'm doing is I'm actually looking at the camera, trying to understand how this thing works and what it is.
Yeah.
And it's one of those, it was one of those twin lens cameras that my uncle had. So it's like, it has like the lens that you look down from the top. And then it was like a medium format thing. And I just thought it was the coolest thing. And yeah, so it's funny to look at that photo now and be like, oh yeah, I was really curious about that,
Yeah.
And, but in terms of computers, I mean, it was probably fourth or fifth grade. And, we had computer labs. It was the 90s. So I went to the computer lab at school and like learned how to, use like an Apple II, learned how to learn BASIC, and just really got into it from there. And then eventually got my own computer at home.
Yeah, here's the question though, because you and I are of a similar age, so I have to ask the question. Whenever I hear computer lab, I'm like, so you played like Half-Life and Counter-Strike in the computer lab, right? Was that a thing? Or no?
Well, like in fourth grade, it was like Oregon Trail.
Sure, of course, yeah. But like once you got into like high school, like like shooter games, school,
right? I got into gaming, but that was also part of my kind of origin story. I mean, when I was in high school, I got so deep into programming that I found this multi-user dungeon, right? And that was like, I was on the internet. I had like gotten internet access through the local university, like by kind of pretending that I was a student. And yeah, I found this multi-user dungeon and I just started playing it. And I became obsessed with it. It was like you would telnet in to the server and like everything was text-based, right? And that was, for me, that was gaming. I mean, I had a Nintendo at home and I would play like when I was a kid, I'd play like Super Mario and stuff. But like, I never really went through like a video game phase. I really got into this mud thing and then eventually started programming for them. Once I like became immortal in the game, like I was like, well, what do I do next? And I was like, well, start looking at like how does this thing work and taking it apart. And yeah. So.
Yeah, it's very funny because I feel like especially folks that grew up in like the late 90s, early 2000s, in that time frame, like video games were so cool, and the idea of like, oh, like maybe I can like build video games. Like, and that was always like a lot of people that I've talked to on the show have been like, oh, like I wanted to play video games. And then I realized that like being a video game developer is not for me. And, figured out some other way to get into like software engineering and so. But it's interesting, like the text-based game, obviously. And like, do you play like DoD? Like, is that something that you did at any point in your life? No. Because the text-based game is very, when I think of it, like, oh, that's like a DoD thing. Like people are very much into like writing steps down, very methodical things like that. So obviously you were introduced to computers at a really good time because computing was becoming more accessible for folks. When did you realize like this is the thing? Was it like right then when you were starting to build out, mud stuff, or was it like you got to university and you're like, okay, well, where are the computer courses at? Like, give me all the computer courses you got.
Oh no, it was early, but I think by the time I was in high school, I knew I wanted to study computer programming and computer engineering or computer science in college. Yeah, I when I was in high school, it was this mud. It was I was working at an internet provider, so that because the university ended up taking away my account when they found out I wasn't a student. So I went and I didn't have any money. So I went to this internet provider, like a local internet provider. And I was like, can I just intern with you guys for a free account?
Yeah.
And it ended up being a great situation. I would go after school, and they had like a T1. So I would like, they had like what was a T1 connection? It was like 16 megabits or 24 megabits or something.
All I know is it was very fast. Very fast.
At the time, it was really fast. Yeah.
Yeah. Like,
yeah.
I have a visceral reaction to the first time I ever like got on the internet, like at home, and like because I think we had like a 28.8K modem when I was growing up. I live out in the middle of nowhere. And then like the school got T1, which I think it's like 1.5 or 2 MBS.
Yeah, it's closer to 1 megabit. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So like I remember just like sitting down and like going to like yahoo.com or something like that, or some basic website, and just being shocked at how fast it was. Like absolutely shocked. And I realized very quickly, like there's lots that you can, because obviously I guess we were more patient back then. Like we were very like with 28.8, like you could go to a website, then you could like get up, go get a drink, go get a snack, come back, and the website might be done, right? Depending on how many graphics or images or whatever. But T1 at the time, it seemed so fast. And now it's crazy to think that like typical household internet speeds are, 100x that. 1,000x that. It's absolutely insane. Like you can get like we have fiber in my house and it's like one up and one down, and it's like insanely cheap. I don't understand. Like I do understand technically, like I guess how it works, but it is crazy. Like, do you remember? Like, did you have that same feeling that I had, where it's like the world kind of opened up? Like because obviously you have like a little bit of handcuff or a little bit of chains, like with very slow internet connection. Did you realize very quickly like this is it? Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, you can kind of feel, especially as I look back and you're asking me about kind of these early experiences, like it's like you can feel Moore's law at work, right? And it's network speeds, it's like the pixel density of the displays, and the number of colors and the amount of RAM that you have and the amount of disk space. I mean, I didn't have I had a Commodore 64, that was 64K of RAM, right? That was my first computer at home. So,
it's absolutely insane to me. Like, and again, I think it's probably like in the last 10, 15 years, we've in my opinion, we've gotten a bit more, I don't know what's the best way to phrase this, impatient. And I don't know if that's because of the access of information is just so high. But it seems to me like the idea that you could just wait and be okay waiting. And now, like, I mean, if I don't have 5G on my phone, I scream really loud, right? It is crazy to me, like how patient we were growing up, because we didn't know any better. Now we have access to everything, and we're very impatient as a society.
But I wonder, like, the payloads are so much bigger now than they used to be, right? Like everything's like, So it's also just, it still takes a long time sometimes to load websites, even though it shouldn't. Why should it? They should be fast.
And I don't know if this was a little bit after your time. It was like right in the crux of I graduated high school in 2004, just to date me. So like MySpace.com was a huge thing when I was like end of high school, beginning of college, and like the whole idea of like customizing MySpace pages. Right, where you can add your own CSS and HTML, and you can crash browsers. I talk about this way too much on the show. I should probably stop talking about it. Like, was that like
It was a magic time.
Yeah, was like that creativity, like with the web, was that something that always interested you, or were you more interested in like the infrastructure, how things work sort of side of technology?
I was into both,
Yeah,
especially in high school. And I made a website in high school called How Do They Do That with HTML? And it was just like me learning HTML and
yeah,
just explaining what I was learning to people. And it ended up becoming a super popular website because there weren't that many resources at the time, kind of on the early web for learning how to make a web page. And yeah, and then at the same time, I was learning Linux 1.0 and like Vim and like, how I was running the DNS servers at the ISP that I worked at. And so there was like, yeah, I was into all of it. For it was very, very full stack.
yeah. Oh well,
I need to let my dog out
no
the door
worries,
here. For one
no
second.
worries. And you have
Sorry.
your headset in, so as you can hear me while I'm talking. So like
Yes, I can.
the web it's funny that you mentioned like the idea of full stack, right? Like, and we can talk about naming conventions and how different roles are talked about because I'd love to get your thoughts because, but the idea of full stack to me is so funny. I think it works back then, right? When
Yeah,
like
exactly,
there
exactly.
was
It
there
used to be
was
a
a
thing.
yeah, like where you knew a little bit of JavaScript, enough JavaScript to like survive. You had a little bit of CSS skills before like CSS got really confusing, and like you could do some HTML, maybe some PHP or Perl or something, or maybe even .NET or Java, right? But now, the idea of a full stack developer, to me, I laugh whenever if I talk to somebody recently who's like, "Oh, I'm a full stack developer." I'm like, okay, so you have to have like 70 tools open, and you kind of like you're not an expert in anything. Like nobody's an expert in anything, but you have to slack through like a bunch of different programming languages and context switch all the time, and that sounds very exhausting to me. Like, what are your thoughts about? Because we kind of go through this idea in tech. We super specialize in like a particular technology or a skill, and then we back out, and then there's maybe there's a cycle of being more generalist. And I think
Hmm.
now, like, we're at this generalist phase where people kind of have to know everything. Like, do you see sometime in the future where we get back to that hyper specialized? Like, we still have people that are specialized today, but the expectation is that if I'm a developer today, I need to know front end development, I need to know back end development, I need to know infrastructure, I need to know orchestration, I need to know these things. Like, if I'm working like a generalist technologist job, right?
Mm.
Like, do you see like the world swinging back where, hey, like there's only really front end engineers we're looking for, or we're only looking for DevOps architects or whatever that role will be, right? Like, do you see that swinging back, or are we always kind of be in this stuck where it's like every technologist has to master like 70 tools?
I think I like the idea that IDEO has about this, which is they call it T-shaped people,
Yeah, yeah,
the letter T, where you have breadth and depth, and I think that's really what I think that's really valuable in tech to have breadth and depth. And you have to just choose wisely what you're specializing in. For me, I specialized in different things at different times in my career just because
yeah,
my curiosity took me there.
yeah,
And right now I'm doing this deep dive on cybersecurity stuff,
yeah.
and it's not even I've never had a role in this space before, but that's part of the fun of it.
Yeah, I'm interested to get your thoughts too. As I was kind of doing a little bit of research, like you have made this jump into cybersecurity, and I think when I think of cybersecurity, I think there's kind of like two types of folks: folks that have been doing it since like the '90s, and like they can read out like SHA hashes, they're just like savants in this space. And then there's the folks, and if it's not correct or not accurate, please correct me. Like the folks that are like you, that they're curious about it and they come into the space and they realize, oh, like there's some interesting problems that need to be solved here. Like, and I'd love to kind of get your thoughts as somebody who was in that second tier. Like, what are some of the things
Mhm.
that you were like that fascinate you about cybersecurity, and at least initially?
Yeah, I mean, I always liked it. I remember in college learning about like buffer overflow exploits and
Sure,
things like
sure.
that in just different classes. But like, but yeah, I think I think for me, it's the chance to be a beginner again, right?
Yeah.
And I came into this and I sat down with Mike Malone, who's our CEO, for coffee when we first met, and you know we it was going to be like a 30-minute coffee, and we ended up talking for like 3 hours
Yeah.
about like TLS and X509 certificates, and I was just like, it actually surprised me, right? It was like I was like, why is this so interesting to me? I don't know, but I don't need to know why it's so interesting.
Yeah.
I'm just going to follow this because clearly I'm lit up by this
Yeah.
material, right? And yeah, and so I think one of the great things about this role has been um, learning as I go, and then writing from that space of someone who's a beginner or is like, you know, just learning about something for the first time, because I think that's what worked about that HTML guide that I wrote in high school, was that I was excited about it, and my passion came through on the web page, you know, as much as the technical information. And I mean, you know, we've all read technical documents that are super dry and super
Yeah.
hard to get
Yeah.
through, and we've all read technical stuff that's really well written, and
Mm-hmm.
it's so much easier, right? And so I think one of my kind of highest goals on the writing side of things is to is to transmit my excitement along
That,
with whatever it is I'm trying to share
yeah,
technically.
that's a great way to phrase it. Transmit your excitement, because I think in maybe I'm making an assessment of you, an assumption of you based on this conversation so far, but you're a very curious person. You probably were the person that at a job, when anybody was like, hey, does anybody know this? You'd probably raise your hand and say no, but I'm interested about it, so I'll start looking into it, right? Like, I think a lot of us in technology, we fall into that camp of always being curious, which I think helps us get through a lot of the struggles in technology. So, like, I'd love to kind of talk a little bit about, like, you mentioned something, I want to drill into it very briefly, like the idea of like there's some documentation or some technical white papers or I guess written word in tech that are very challenging to read and some that is very good. And I've always said that it's like an art form. Like technical writing is very much an art form, like more than any other thing, to the effect that in the past when I've worked at companies where I've had the opportunity to like help hire technical writers, I'm more interested in folks that have an English background than folks that have a technology background. And I'd love to get your thoughts about technical writing in general, and like, you know, is there things that you see that are well done, things that are, you know, there's room for improvement or opportunities there? And I know that we can, if you're not an expert, we can kind of move on, but I'd love to kind of get your thoughts as somebody who's been in the industry for some time and probably read a lot of good stuff and a lot of not the great stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that first and foremost, okay, so like when I'm think you have me thinking about what technical documentation I consume, right? And one of the things I consume a lot of is just like tutorials for doing certain
Yeah.
things. Like, um, and I'm just gonna name like DigitalOcean does a great job of this, where they
Yes.
have a
Yeah.
lot of tutorials on their website for doing all kinds of different things
With
with
samples
virtual
too.
machines.
With samples too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you know what, they work, and that is the number one like most important thing, is the consistency, that you go through these tutorials and you run those commands and they actually run and they work, and there's like they even have like the date on there, which we're trying to do this in Smallstep too, like with our documentation. They have the date of like the last time someone actually tried this, you know,
Yeah.
and verified that it's working. So like that's obvious, it needs to work, but a lot of people I think don't get that quite right, and things, you know, obviously over time it's hard to keep documentation working. And then, you know, when it comes to the readability thing, just like the pleasure of actually using documentation, I think it's part of the product, it's part of the software, and this is where it gets into open source stuff, right? Like an open source project needs to kind of build the bridge, and this is what we do. We need to build a bridge from um, into the world that it's created, right?
Yeah.
And people need to be able to walk that bridge and understand what they're doing along the way.
I totally agree. I think too, one thing that's very interesting is that, especially like if you're in a technical role, like I love seeing samples. And one thing that I think that's been very interesting, probably in the last 5 years or so, is like click this to run this sample, right? Like obviously not every company can support like doing that sort of thing.
Yeah.
DigitalOcean does it a little bit. Like some of the big cloud providers do it as well. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Because that's like a whole nother level of like learning, right? Like the click and run experience.
I love
right?
that.
It's so cool.
It's like Montessori school.
Yeah, exactly.
Like
right?
I want that. I love that. Yeah.
I think too, like, I mean, it's almost to the point now where if I'm trying out some tool or some provider or something, and I go to the docs and like, I don't immediately get to like code samples. I immediately am like, where are the code samples? Like, where's the GitHub repo? Where's whatever, right? To the effect that like when I used to work in product marketing, and I used to talk to folks about like technical documentations, like you got to get people to like the code as fast as possible, because it's proven that like the most engaged content that exists on any technical website or any blog, website, docs, or whatever is the section where the code is. And whether that's people copy pasting or people staying on the page longer so they can type it out themselves, like, what do you think? And this is kind of to continue to drill into this idea of like written content. Like when is it like, especially as somebody that's like who is working at a small company trying to figure out how to manage different ways to do written content. Like what is like is this a doc? Is this a blog? Is this some other form of medium? Like when you go through creating content, like what's your kind of decision tree as it pertains to like how should I have this content or this idea exposed to the audience?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'll answer it kind of from the side of open source. So
sure, please do.
We have at Smallstep, we have our main, we're an open core company, right? And we have a certificate authority server that is like our main open source project. It's called StepCA. And so there's a certificate authority server there, and then there's a command line tool that is called Step. That's like the client side of that, but it also does a whole bunch of other kind of like common like cryptography tasks and things like that. And so these two projects kind of fit together, and people often find them through GitHub. They find them through our GitHub page, and that's the beginning of the journey that you're talking about, right? Like that GitHub README has to have a clear description of what is this thing, what does it do, how does it work, how do you install it and get started, and then linking off to deeper documentation, right? And so yeah, there's the GitHub page, there's the docs website, there's the help like on the CLI, right? All of the help text. There's blog posts and webinars and things like that. I think of it like the blog posts and the webinars are kind of the most like casual content, right? Like I will use a more conversational tone when I'm writing that stuff, and it's not meant to be like perfectly evergreen, and I may not even update it that often, right? Like we're just going through for the first time after like 3 years to update some of our blog posts, so it's not guaranteed to be like super fresh. Documentation, on the other hand, is like something that we really like pay a lot of attention to maintaining and updating and keeping it. It's always going to work, right? Like fixing bugs in it, and then there's tutorials inside the documentation that are kind of like recipes. Those are the standard recipes that we need those to always work. And sometimes a blog post becomes one of those recipes, right? Or kind of gets folded into the documentation, but it's I think these are all different entry points for the project, because sometimes people are saying, I need a certificate authority, and that's how they find us. And other times they're like, how do I do this very particular thing? Like one of the first blog posts I wrote for Smallstep was doing single sign-on SSH, a whole tutorial for single sign-on SSH. And it's like, okay, people will search for that, right? Like, how do I do SSH with single sign-on?
And you mentioned something too that I think is so important. Like, if you can't make sure that your content is kind of like forever green, right? Making sure that it's time stamped at some particular time, and if it's something that does go outdated, making sure that it's well known that it's outdated, or attempt to update as quickly as possible, right? Because I mean, everybody that's listening, you, me, we've all done that thing where we'll do a Google search and we'll click on a blog post and see that it's like from 2 years ago and immediately close the tab, right?
Exactly.
Because
I
more than
even use
likely,
it, and I
yeah,
use the search tools thing all the time, right? Where you say in
yeah,
Google, where you say like last year or last month, because I
yeah.
just don't want to see that stuff.
Yeah, I totally agree, and it's challenging in some spaces too because, depending on like some tech, like there hasn't been a lot of churn, but there's been just enough churn where maybe half of a blog post or an article is still accurate, but the rest of it is not, right? That's challenging too.
Yep.
I just when I write content, I'm very of the mindset like if people come to it like 6 months later, more than likely it's outdated and they'll figure that out on their own, which is hard, right? I like too like like you talked about webinars, and I've always kind of had like a love-hate relationship with webinars because I love the medium. I love like the video, conversation type of experience with webinars. But I always feel like they're very, and this is not fair, somebody who used to be in marketing, they're very marketing, right?
Yeah.
They're very gimmicky. And I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on some of the things that you've used or things that you've observed when you're building out webinars that like, have led to like meaningful conversations. Because I think one thing that's very clear is that a lot of us in technology, like we have like a pretty high BS meter. And like when we're being marketed to, we kind of get turned off generally.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So like, what is your process around building webinars in that particular, or is yours just like your target audience is not the same target audience as other content types?
I think it's, yeah. So, I mean, for me, I've only done a couple of them now, and they often come out of blog posts. So I'll start with a blog post, and then I'll turn it into a webinar. And blog posts at our company have also become conference talks and things like that, right? So we try to kind of like take the content that we make and chop it up in different ways and reuse it, because people like to consume content in different ways, and I think it has more to do with like people's personalities and how they like to consume things than necessarily the audience, right? Because if I've taken a blog post and turned it into a webinar, it's going to be probably the same audience.
Yeah.
Is my guess. I'm not sure. But the best one that we did was one with YubiKeys, where you can. I wrote this post about accessing your home lab through YubiKeys with a YubiKey for authentication and using mutual TLS, and it was like so much fun. And we had a lot of participation, a lot of Q&A, and people were really engaged. I think what worked about it was that it's like a very practical, clear, helpful task and challenge.
Sure.
That we step through and then talk about, right? As opposed to just like something more theoretical or, open-ended that doesn't really always go somewhere.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with the idea that, you have to be very methodical with any sort of content, but specifically content that is usually more longer form, like webinars are typically like longer in nature, because you need to capture people's attention for that entire webinar to get satisfactory engagement. Whether you're doing a demo during that or you're having some sort of audience participation, which some webinar tools are really good at, some of them are not very good at. I think too, one thing that I've started to think about as well is like certain types of content aren't for every single person too, right? Like if you're trying to talk to like a C-suite executive or a VP, like certain content is going to resonate with that individual more than others. Things like white papers or webinars are a good example of like, in marketing lingo, we use like the term business decision maker, BDM, or technical decision maker, TDM. Like basically like the people that have a V in front of their title or a C in front of their title, like those are really good audiences for webinars because they kind of need some compactable version of what you're trying to sell. And then maybe you have other content from that webinar that feeds more to your developer persona, right? Yeah. Do you folks kind of incorporate a similar thing where you'll take some content and then kind of reuse it in different levels to different personas?
For sure. Yeah. We do. Because we definitely have that distinction that you're talking about between, our product is very technical and it tends to be seen and used by the technical folks first. And then, they'll talk to the buyer and convince them to um, to become a customer.
Yeah.
Um, and we're kind of trying to figure out like how do you flip that, and or not necessarily flip it, but just like how do you actually appeal to the
Yeah.
buyer persona also, right, as part of the effort. And yeah, I mean we've been doing that for all along, but I think we're learning a lot about that right now, and we're kind of getting more clear about who that buyer persona is and how to actually reach them in a meaningful way, right? Um, yeah.
I mean, it's very interesting. And I imagine because of the area of business that you folks are in, like the cybersecurity business, like the number one driver for interest is like, oh, we don't want to be hacked. We don't want to be breached. We don't want to have our intellectual property, our customer data, like out there in the world, right? So there's already like that level of like it's needed, but there's also like a lot of black box sort of thing with a lot of security pieces to technology. I'd love to kind of get your thoughts as like, how do you phrase the conversation? Because otherwise, like, people are just saying, I need this thing because I saw some big company A got hacked and I don't want that to happen to us.
It's challenging, and then what's particularly challenging for us is that so so to answer your question first, like we frame it in terms of identity, right? Because it's really like so zero trust has become really popular in the security space, and the whole idea of zero trust is really what's foundational to zero trust is you need authenticated encryption.
Sure.
And the only way to get that is, I mean, not the only way, but the most popular way to do that is TLS, right? Because you have certificates, and the certificates have identities. And if you're using mutual TLS, then both the client and server have an identity. They actually have an identity that some third party that we all trust has said, this is Carl, and this is the MySQL server or whatever. You kind of need that as a starting point for zero trust, because then you start making all kinds of decisions based on those identities. And so, okay, so where am I going with this? I think that the challenge for us, though, as a company, is that there's so many use cases for certificates that we have customers, potential customers coming at us with so many different things they want to do, right? It might be IoT company one day, and it might be someone wanting to do Wi-Fi access with certificates the next day, and then Kubernetes certificates, and then I'm trying to secure my database, and we do all of that stuff, right? Managed device attestation, right, is this thing that just came up at WWDC, where like you can you can do this like zero touch provisioning of new devices if you're a company, right? And you can send out devices to your employees, and like everything just spins up and starts. And we make a Acme server that is like part of that flow, right? That didn't used to exist in the Apple world. And so now we have this whole world of like managed device, like MDM and managed device attestation, or managed devices that was not really on our radar before a year ago, right? Yeah. Because it just wasn't available. So
like the strides have been made in this space, particularly like, and I don't know if a lot of it was kind of, catalyzed by, the pandemic, or, lots of, the necessity to work from home, but like the idea of like, you can't go somewhere to like pick up a device, a company device. It has to be shipped to you, and it has to be like, you turn on and it just magically works, or you're on the phone with somebody and it magically works, right? Like everything is remote to an extent. And it is interesting that like, I feel like there's been a couple of, I guess, innovations that have happened in the last 3 years that I'm like, oh, like I wonder if that's like like a technology innovation thing, or if that's like we had no other option thing. So for some of the things that you just brought up, like, mobile device management or key attestation or some of these things, like, do you see them as things that have been brewing for a long time and just happened to come out during the same time when nobody could go into an office anymore? Or anymore is not the right word.
I think so. Yeah, and I think at that cutting edge right now, what I see, and it's funny because I call it cutting edge, but it's really ubiquitous, right? It's like the idea of like the secure element and TPMs, right? TPMs are ubiquitous now, and they weren't ubiquitous like a year ago.
Yeah.
And so when now that they're ubiquitous, like there's so much that becomes possible with hardware bound keys and TPM attestations. Um, that you couldn't do. Like you just couldn't really. You could write something. TPM 2.0 has been around for a few years, but like nobody had it.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting when things reach that moment of ubiquity is really an important moment, as well as um, when things are first introduced, right?
Yeah, it is kind of interesting too. Like, you know, and as somebody who has gone through like a handful of different, like, these are the kind of exploits that are very popular at the time. A lot of them, where software based, and now we're getting to this world where it's like almost all of the major exploits that aren't like software or like aren't like social engineering are all hardware based, right? Like,
Right.
are we ever going to solve that? Because I think, and obviously it's hard to put on prediction hat or whatever, but I'm always curious because it seems to me like the pace at which chips are produced and hardware is produced, it has to be so fast to catch up with demand of millions and millions of things. Like there's always going to be opportunities or things that are kind of missed along, I guess, the supply chain, right? But do we ever do you see at some point this magical world where hardware is 99.9% secure, 100% secure? Do you see that, or we're always going to live in this world where, oh yeah, there's like some new processor breach or processor hack or whatever you want to call it, right? Do you see that always being a thing?
It's always been a thing as long as I can remember, so I
Sure.
can't see why it would change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting too because as somebody who's not well versed in it, like I'm just like I try to think about what's the process to like find what these exploits are. I'm very curious because like it's way outside of my ability to comprehend, and people are just trying to find exploits, like some of them good, some of them bad, whatever, right? Like how often do you pay attention to, those sort of forums where people are discussing different mechanisms to breach things? Like, is that a part of your job? Is that something you do out of curiosity? Because I'm always curious too,
Not
because there's this whole
really. Yeah.
underworld of like people
Right.
just want to like get access to different hardware pieces.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. I don't pay a lot of attention to that. I think, yeah, it's just not, that red teaming world of like trying to attack something is its own entire discipline and career path, right? And I'm not going to pretend to be an expert at that one.
Yeah.
It's a whole world. I mean, it really is. And I've talked to some of those folks, had great conversations with them. It's super interesting because, like you say, going at this, I think social engineering has become a lot more popular because we have gotten better at least on the software side. We've just gotten better at securing things
Yeah.
over the years.
Yeah, I think it's
Yeah,
also just easier to trick a human being into doing something silly, right?
yeah,
Like, I mean, not to knock human beings, but for the most part, like, we don't know a lot. Like,
yeah,
especially when it comes to like, you get sent a website link and that website looks like paypal.com, but it's really not paypal.com or whatever, right? Like, that experience, that way to get access to people's information will never go away. And it's obviously the easiest
yeah,
way to get access to stuff. Like it's our responsibility as technologists to like make sure the systems like don't overexpose more than what is just the currently exploited individual is. Because I think that's a real problem, right? Like you socially engineer someone, you get access to their data, and then all of a sudden trickling through systems, you're like, oh, well, I have access to way more than I should. Right. So like
yeah.
what are some of the things that you've seen come out in the last few years in this space to kind of harden those sort of systems?
Yeah, the biggest one is probably uh, hardware, what I would call hardware bound private keys for in asymmetric cryptography in general, right? And this is what we specialize in.
Yeah.
Moving from this world of having symmetric, like just shared secrets everywhere,
Yeah.
to a world where you have, like I'm holding a YubiKey. You have a key that's generated on here, and I can't get it out. I can't export it, and I can produce an attestation certificate from this
Yep.
key that says this is Carl's YubiKey, whatever number this is, slot 9A, and it has this public key
Yeah.
associated with it, right? Like that's unfishable.
Yeah.
Like someone might be able to use it, an attacker might be able to use my key, but they can't steal it,
Yeah. Because
and that's a huge advancement.
it's funny because like I feel like YubiKeys is something that has kind of come and this sort of experience for an end user has kind of come full circle, right? I remember RSA tokens like when I first got started, like you had like the little fob and it had some number in it. You had to frantically put that number in before it refreshed, and like then there was a point in time where that wasn't a thing. Like things like I can't think of the technology that was out that, like in between them that kind of like, oh, you don't need an RSA token because you have single sign on or whatever, like whatever
And
MFA.
then it was then it was the one-time code.
One-time password or MFAs or whatever they are. And now we're kind of back where it's like you need some sort of hardware, even to the extent now where like if you're trying to like sign an application or you're trying to sign something, like you can't like use like an Azure Key Vault or a AWS Certificates Manager. Like it all has to be like it has to be on hardware that is particularly certified with this particular keys. Like so, if you go to like some certificate authority, they'll mail you a key. Like they'll mail you like a little thing, right? It's like that to me. I as an end user, sometimes I think yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, well, I think you were about to say it, which is what's been hard about that is that this feels harder to use,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
But actually, like I also have this keyboard in front of me with the with the Touch ID right here, right? With the so it's like I have biometrics right on my keyboard, and I use that, right? I love this. I love the Touch ID on here, and my phone has it, and it's Face ID. I don't even have to do anything. I mean, it's just like, and this is it's the same stuff as YubiKey, right? You're still getting well, it depends. The Touch ID thing can be used for a lot of different stuff, but these hardware-bound keys can be integrated in a way that is actually really easy to use. And now you have this sweet spot because usually adding more security makes things harder to use, right? But you have this sweet spot where actually, like, not only is this, we're swinging back in this direction of kind of more hardware-based stuff, but it's actually we figured out how to do it now. In a way that is smooth.
I just think the old man that's like deep in me grumbling is like I've lost so many of these things. I'm holding up like a key, right? A YubiKey key. I've lost so many of them because like if you're out traveling and like your laptop only has 2 ports on it. Right. So like, if I want to plug something in, I got to unplug this thing and it's way too small to unplug from a computer. You lose it immediately. So like maybe I'm just grumpy in the effect that like there in some situations you have to have some sort of like dongle to carry around. I totally agree. Like bioscanning is awesome. I also worry sometimes it's like, okay, well, when's that going to get breached? Like, but maybe I'm just being a bit of a pessimist. I do like the idea as well of like, it's all about protection, even though like there's maybe like a mild inconvenience. Like think about what the industry was or these sort of experiences were 10 years ago. You're far less secure. You just didn't know it.
Yeah.
I think one too that I'd love to talk about as well is like some of the stuff that you're doing at Smallstep. Like when I was doing a little bit of research on you, like I loved your title, like Offroad Engineer. Like and I did a little bit of research into it because I never heard the phrase before. Can you explain a little bit like to like what Offroad Engineer is to you and like what makes a difference than like, so you like have like multiple roles tied into one? Like you have some advocacy work in there, you have research, you have doc writing, you have obviously software development. I'd love to kind of get your, abridged version of what that title means to you.
Well, I mean, first of all, I just feel lucky to be at a place in my career where I can make something up like that.
Sure.
That suits me.
Yeah.
And be able to say, this is what I want to do and this is my title. And, it's feels like me, right? when I so I think one of the main things about it is that I'm not on the roadmap. I'm not on the engineering roadmap, but
Sure.
I'm an engineer.
Yeah.
And I think that companies need that, and sometimes it takes different forms. I think every company needs it. Some of it's, there's research work, and so sometimes like a CTO will have like a research person, or sometimes it's the CTO who does this kind of thing. Sometimes the staff engineering, different kinds of staff engineers might do this kind of work. And yeah, for me, it's a little bit more exploratory. And then there's a lot of writing, and there's a lot of advocacy, and I also do some coaching internally
Yeah.
in the company. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating, like the idea of like, you can be a part of the code shipping process, but it's not something that is a core responsibility of the role, right? Like I love the idea of like, if you're in advocacy or if you're in any role that, you're doing a bit of marketing, you're doing a bit of sales, you're doing a bit of advocacy or evangelism or whatever, like being close to the technology is almost essential, right? Over to the effect that like you'll see some engineering, like some advocacy organizations like embedded in engineering, right? And I have thoughts about that. Like I think that there's goods and bads. I'd love to get your thoughts as well too. Like how do we, like, since a big part of your job is content creation, evangelism, and just research in general, like figuring out what customers are doing, figuring out customer pain points, like what is the healthy balance? Because obviously, like I can imagine you very easily could turn this job into marketing sales, and you kind of lose all of the technical depth that you're probably looking for.
Yeah. I mean, I think I have to navigate that every day, right?
Yeah.
I don't have a total answer to that, but it's an intuitive thing. And I mean, for me, it feels very comfortable in part because when I was in my, like right after college, my first job after college was at Zipcar.
Okay.
And I was employee number 8, and talk about full stack engineering. I was working on like all the way down to the firmware and all the way
Everything.
up to the web app.
Yeah.
Right?
Everything. Yeah.
And it was all there was 3 of us, and we were all extreme full stack engineers. And we would all do anything in the stack. We all knew the entire code base in and out. So we didn't really specialize. But we had areas that we kind of owned. We had no product management, right? And we had no like roadmap in the way that people do now.
Yeah.
And so I think that I learned engineering from this place of like walking in each day and looking at what's going on and saying, how can I make this thing that I'm building work better and be smoother? And, looking at what are people complaining about, and what, just like listening, and then having that feedback loop, that constant feedback loop, become something that I embody rather than somebody telling me, Carl, you need to do these things next, right?
Yeah.
And so I came up doing that, and I think that that's why the idea for me of like being off-road just makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would, like, you mentioned something about Zipcar, right? Like, we don't need to talk about Zipcar, but like, I think it's always interesting to me when companies don't realize that technology is like the business, and like they have some other thing that's like, oh, this is the business. Like the actual, like the cars are the business. Like, no. Right. The technology is the business. The cars are just the implementation of the technology. I like, that is always funny to me. Like you meant, and the reason why I think about that is you said like there was no like project management or no product management, right? And to me, that all, like as a developer, I'm like, oh, that sounds amazing. Like people aren't like asking me all the time for estimates and deliverables, but like at the same time, like as somebody who has been in that situation, oh, that means I was doing PM work too, on top of having to ship code, which is super exciting in quotes.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean that's
it's not for everyone, and it's also not for every company. And I think it's a certain size company that could even do that. And I don't know that many companies do that today, right? It doesn't seem common.
Yeah, and I've talked to a few startups in the last couple of years, just conversations similar to this or job potentials or whatever, and it seems to me this is what the current flow is for building out a company. You have some engineers, like a founder, somebody who's technical, and these are technical startups, just for whatever. Mm-hmm. And then so they have engineers, and then they immediately build out sales, right? Like once they have like a viable MVP or POC or prototype or whatever, like can we get this thing to market? And then after that, it's product, because they realize like customers have questions and demands, so we need somebody to figure out navigating product roadmap and all that. And then like way down the line, like marketing comes, because I think the expectation is like, oh, sales can be marketing initially. And the conversations I've had with a couple of founders, it's always like, so why are you doing marketing now? You're at 70 employees or 60 employees. Like, why marketing now? And the response is always funny. It's always basically like, oh, we didn't think that marketing was essential to build up the business. I'm like, well, now you have like actual things, and you don't have a way to market. You have a website. You don't have partner marketing or regional marketing or anything. And so that's always interesting to me. But that's a different tangent for a different day.
Feel bad for that person who joined at that point and has all this like years of work to do that they weren't doing.
Or you're doing the job of like 5 different marketing backgrounds, right? Which is always exciting. So like, you started out, I mean, good, bad, or indifferent, like in a somewhat chaotic way, right? Like employee number 8 at Zipcar sounds like fascinating to me, just for a lot of reasons. And now you've going through your history, you've kind of navigated, consultancy, teaching, founding of different engineering groups, and now you're kind of at this. I mean, I almost kind of want to phrase it as, if this was a larger company. Like if this was like, a FANG company or a company that's public, like your title would probably be something like it was in my head, like, but I can't remember what it is. Like, but it'd be like, you'd be like an individual contributor who kind of helps like drive innovation. I can't think of the title. I literally just had it, but, I think, is that fair to say? Is it, you're kind of, you're in this world where you're very hyper focused on like driving innovation at the business?
I think that's part of it. I'm
sorry to interrupt you, but distinguished engineer was the title that I was thinking of.
Oh yeah. I mean, it sounds nice.
yeah. Distinguished never hurts to be called distinguished, right?
Yeah. Maybe something like that. I've thought staff engineering. I think that there's a need for, I think documentation is kind of glue too. Yeah. And I think that I also kind of act as glue socially in the organization as well. But I'm not like in a role that's like product where you're at the hub of all this stuff, right? Yeah. I'm kind of in the sidelines in some ways, like, but the way that I operate socially in the organization, I think is acts as a kind of glue.
That's really, I like the way you phrase that. Yeah.
Mentoring is important to me, so I do some of that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to talk with you too about mentoring, and maybe we can, in the future we can have you on where we can talk solely about mentoring, because I love hearing how different folks' approaches are to mentoring and how getting that next generation of technologists like excited about the work. I do want to kind of close on this one sort of topic, and the name of the show is Coffee and Open Source, and Smallstep, a big part of their origin as well as your mission is open source and the community around open source, right? Like, how do you find and I would love to kind of hear your thoughts about best ways to engage with the community, the open source community. Like, I love the open source community. They're also at sometimes can be a bit challenging to engage with if you're depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Like, I'd love to kind of, I'm going to stop talking. I'd love to hear your thoughts on open source and how Smallstep, engages with them.
I mean, I think that we're in a sort of different position than some other open source projects in the sense that the stuff that we do is quite arcane. And, secure, like certificate authorities are arcane. Yeah. And I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just like it's a niche, right? Sure. And one of the things that it's been kind of most important, I think, in my mind for this role and for our work um, is to teach to teach security, to teach information security, to teach certificate authorities like how to how to create a public key infrastructure and run one, because the goal of the open source project is that you can do that yourself, and
Mm-hmm.
we have sane defaults, right? Like we've made choices for you so that you don't have to, we've reduced the number of foot guns or whatever you want to call them,
Sure.
um, so that you can stand something up and actually make it work, and you don't have to be a security engineer to do it. So appealing to the like general software engineers, generalists, and helping them kind of learn what they need to know in order to do this,
Yeah.
and best practices and things like that. So, like we have like a Discord that's very active, and GitHub discussions we use for like connecting with people, and then I find that you know I know what you're talking about in terms of some of the kind of more negative sides of like the open source community. And
Sure.
what's interesting is that I've noticed that's not really present in this particular project.
Maybe it's the
And
space. Maybe it's the space. Yeah.
yeah, maybe it's the space. I don't know. I don't know. I don't really have a good answer for that. But yeah, it's just people have been great on GitHub, and you know, I've been able to meet a lot of interesting developers and folks working on all kinds of different roles using our stuff and trying to get it to to serve them.
I mean, that's
So
great. If like, I think the hardest part about doing this work is figuring out like how do you win over the community, right? Because at the end of the day,
yeah,
the community is going to champion whatever you're trying to accomplish, right? And it sounds like you folks have, I don't want to say figured it out, but I think that you've gotten to the point where, for you to say like we haven't had any negative experiences with the open source community, I mean, like that's awesome. Like that is not the norm, right? And
I
maybe
know it's not the norm. Yeah,
yeah, and maybe it's just because the security space, like the folks that I follow in the security space on different social media, like they all seem like lovely folks. So maybe it's just only lovely folks,
yeah,
only in the security space. But I
yeah,
think I like to something that you said specifically about it's about responsibility too. Like I think one thing that a lot of companies don't do correctly is like just coming out to open source and like kind of like with some particular agenda and trying to move narratives,
yeah.
right? And
Right.
it doesn't seem like you folks are doing that, which is awesome, because again, like we mentioned this a bit earlier, like technologists in general like have a very hard time with like being told what to do, being marketed to, be folks that aren't
Totally.
genuine.
I'm very sensitive to that. I think one of the reasons I like this role is that I'm an engineer, right? And like
Yep.
at heart, and I get to be that. And people, so when I write blog posts, like people know they're reading something written by an engineer, and I think
Yeah.
that makes it more genuine. And we also have like a bunch of the folks from our engineering team like chime in on things on Discord and GitHub, and like they're part of the conversation, like everybody is. And
Yeah.
so yeah, we take this stuff seriously. I think. Yeah, it's yeah,
I think it's great. I think, as long as we can empower the community to, because at the end of the day, like the only reason why any of us exist is to make some company money, whether it's the company we work for, our
yep,
partners, our
yep,
customers, whatever. It's all about making money, right? And if we
yep.
can do it in an ethical way, like that is absolutely awesome, right?
Yeah, I mean,
And
it's a challenge for us though. Like certainly
yeah,
there's trade-offs, right? We have to make choices about what goes into commercial product and what goes into open source,
yeah.
as any company does, so that we can continue to exist, right? So
Yeah,
that's the
it's
challenge.
yeah. I mean, yeah. Like I've had plenty of conversation about productizing open source, and that's very fascinating to me as well. Like, there is a very fine line where if you don't ship particular functionality or particular feature or particular experience in the open source version of the product, like you could it could go very poorly, right?
Yeah,
And I think that that's something that every company that dabbles in open source or even builds their entire business on open source has to kind of think about methodically. Like if like this feature, all of our customers ask for it, if we just provide it in the commercial product, is that going to be a problem to the open source community?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I think with that, as we wrap up, this has been a great conversation, Carl. As somebody who's not a security expert and hasn't had a lot of opportunity to be in this space, it's been really amazing for me to have a chat with you and learn a bit more about what you're doing and some of the different innovations that have happened over the last few years that really have made life a bit safer for folks. And I want to thank you for coming on the show and chatting with me more about it. I do have one final question. I lied to you. I do have one stage question at the end, and that question is, if you can think about the conversation that we've had about technology, the security, community, open source, this conversation we've had, and you can summarize it, but you only had one word to summarize it, what would that word be for you? And you can cheat. You don't have to use one word, but one word is always funner. Enjoyable. Oh, man. All right.
Thank you, Isaac. I really appreciate you having me on the show today.
Yeah, this was great. And thank you so much for being on the show. And for folks that, you want to learn more about what Carl's doing, you can find them on Mastodon. So tech.lgbt/@Tashian. It's TASHIAN. There'll also be a link to some other places that you can find him on different tech social media, as well as learn more about Smallstep, which is where he has the best title ever, Offroad Engineer. And with that, Carl, do you have any parting words or things you'd like to add before we sign off for today?
I just want to say thanks, and I really appreciate your service to the open source community.
Well, thank you. I try. And hopefully everybody here had a good time listening in, whether it's now live or in the future. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Yeah, you too. All right.